Chapter 8 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Renata McLaughlin. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Chapter 8. Strange Doings for George. That evening George sat so long over the newspapers that, in spite of my absorbing interest in the topic engrossing me, I fell asleep in my cozy little rocking chair. I was awakened by what seemed like a kiss falling very softly on my forehead, though, to be sure, it may have been only the flap of George's coat sleeve as he stooped over me. "Wake up, little woman," I heard, "and trot away to bed. I'm going out, and may not be in till daybreak." "You? Going out? At 10 o'clock at night? Tired as you are, as we both are? What has happened? Oh!" This broken exclamation escaped me as I perceived in the dim background by the sitting-room door the figure of a man who called up recent but very thrilling experiences. "Mr. Sweetwater," explained George, "we are going out together. It is necessary, or you may be sure I should not leave you." I was quite wide awake enough by now to understand. "Oh, I know. You are going to hunt up the man. How I wish—" But George did not wait for me to express my wishes. He gave me a little good advice as to how I had better employ my time in his absence, and was off before I could find words to answer. This ends all I have to say about myself, but the events of that night, carefully related to me by George, are important enough for me to describe them with all the detail which is their rightful due. I shall tell the story as I have already been led to do in other portions of this narrative, as though I were present and shared the adventure. As soon as the two were in the street, the detective turned towards George and said, "Mr. Anderson, I have a great deal to ask of you. The business before us is not a simple one, and I fear that I shall have to subject you to more inconvenience than is customary in matters like this. Mr. Brotherson has vanished. That is, in his own proper person, but I have an idea that I am on the track of one who will lead us very directly to him if we manage the affair carefully. What I want of you, of course, is mere identification. You saw the face of the man who washed his hands in the snow, and would know it again, you say. Do you think you could be quite sure of yourself if the man were differently dressed and differently occupied?" "I think so. There's his height, and a certain strong look in his face. I cannot describe it." "You don't need to. Come. We're all right. You don't mind making a night of it?" "Not if it is necessary." "That we can't tell yet." And with a characteristic shrug and smile, the detective led the way to a taxicab which stood in waiting at the corner. A quarter of an hour of rather fast riding brought them into a tangle of streets on the east side. As George noticed the swarming sidewalks and listened to the noises incident to an overpopulated quarter, he could not forbear, despite the injunction he had received, to express his surprise at the direction of their search. "Surely," he said, "the gentleman I have described can have no friends here." Then, bethinking himself, he added, "But if he has reasons to fear the law, naturally he would seek to lose himself in a place as different as possible from his usual haunts." "Yes, that would be some men's way," was the curt, almost indifferent answer he received. Sweetwater was looking this way and that from the window beside him, and now, leaning out, gave some directions to the driver which altered their course. When they stopped, which was in a few minutes, he said to George, "We shall have to walk now for a block or two. I am anxious to attract no attention, nor is it desirable for you to do so. If you can manage to act as if you were accustomed to the place and just leave all the talking to me, we ought to get along first rate. Don't be astonished at anything you see, and trust me for the rest, that's all." They alighted, and he dismissed the taxicab. Some clock in the neighborhood struck the hour of 10. "Good, we shall be in time," muttered the detective, and led the way down the street and around a corner or so until they came to a block darker than the rest, and much less noisy. It had a sinister look, and George, who is brave enough under all ordinary circumstances, was glad that his companion wore a badge and carried a whistle. He was also relieved when he caught sight of the burly form of a policeman in the shadow of one of the doorways. Yet the houses he saw before him were not so very different from those they had already passed. His uneasiness could not have sprung from them. They had even an air of positive respectability, as though inhabited by industrious workmen. Then what was it which made the close companionship of a member of the police so uncommonly welcome? Was it a certain aspect of solitariness which clung to the block, or was it the sudden appearance here and there of a strangely gliding figure, which no sooner loomed up against the snowy perspective than disappeared again in the unseen doorways? "There's a meeting on tonight of the Associated Brotherhood of the Awl, the Plane, and the Trowel," whatever that means, "and it is the speaker we want to see, the man who is to address them promptly at 10 o'clock. Do you object to meetings?" "Is this a secret one?" "It wasn't advertised." "Are we carpenters or masons that we can count on admittance?" "I am a carpenter. Don't you think you can be a mason for the occasion?" "I doubt it, but—" "Hush! I must speak to this man." George stood back, and a few words passed between Sweetwater and a shadowy figure which seemed to have sprung up out of the sidewalk. "Balked at the outset," were the encouraging words with which the detective rejoined George. "It seems that a password is necessary, and my friend has been unable to get it. Will the speaker pass out this way?" he inquired of the shadowy figure still lingering in their rear. "He didn't go in by it yet. I believe he's safe enough inside," was the muttered answer. Sweetwater had no relish for disappointments of this character, but it was not long before he straightened up and allowed himself to exchange a few more words with this mysterious person. These appeared to be of a more encouraging nature than the last, for it was not long before the detective returned with renewed alacrity to George, and, wheeling him about, began to retrace his steps to the corner. "Are we going back? Are you going to give up the job?" George asked. "No, we're going to take him from the rear. There's a break in the fence. Oh, we'll do very well, trust me." George laughed. He was growing excited, but not altogether agreeably so. "He says that he has seen moments of more pleasant anticipation. Evidently my good husband is not cut out for detective work." Where they went under this officer's guidance he cannot tell. The tortuous tangle of alleys through which he now felt himself led was dark as the nether regions to his unaccustomed eyes. There was snow under his feet, and now and then he brushed against some obtruding object, or stumbled against a low fence. But beyond these slight miscalculations on his own part, he was a mere automaton in the hands of his eager guide, and only became his own man again when they suddenly stepped into an open yard, and he could discern plainly before him the dark walls of a building pointed out by Sweetwater as their probable destination. Yet even here they encountered some impediment which prohibited a close approach. A wall or shed cut off their view of the building's lower story, and though somewhat startled at being left unceremoniously alone after just a whispered word of encouragement from the ever-ready detective, George could quite understand the necessity which that person must feel for a quiet reconnoitering of the surroundings before the two of them ventured further forward in their possibly hazardous undertaking. Yet the experience was none too pleasing to George, and he was very glad to hear Sweetwater's whisper again at his ear, and to feel himself rescued from the pool of slush in which he had been left to stand. "The approach is not all that can be desired," remarked the detective as they entered what appeared to be a low shed. "The broken board has been put back and securely nailed in place, and if I am not very much mistaken, there is a fellow stationed in the yard who will want the password too. Looks shady to me. I'll have something to tell the chief when I get back." "But what are we going to do if we cannot get in front or rear?" "We're going to wait right here in the hopes of catching a glimpse of our man as he comes out," returned the detective, drawing George towards a low window overlooking the yard he had described as sentineled. "He will have to pass directly under this window on his way to the alley," Sweetwater went on to explain. "And if I can only raise it, but the noise would give us away. I can't do that." "Perhaps it swings on hinges," suggested George. "It looks like that sort of a window." "If it should, well, it does. We're in great luck, sir. But before I pull it open, remember that from the moment I unlatch it, everything said or done here can be heard in the adjoining yard. So no whispers and no unnecessary movements. When you hear him coming, as sooner or later you certainly will, fall carefully to your knees and lean down just far enough to catch a glimpse of him before he steps down from the porch. If he stops to light his cigar or to pass a few words with some of the men he will leave behind, you may get a plain enough view of his face or figure to identify him. The light is burning low in that rear hall, but it will do. If it does not, if you can't see him, or if you do, don't hang out of the window more than a second. Duck after your first look. I don't want to be caught at this job with no better opportunity for escape than we have here. Can you remember all that?" George pinched his arm encouragingly, and Sweetwater, with an amused grunt, softly unlatched the window and pulled it wide open. A fine sleet flew in, imperceptible save the sensation of damp it gave, and the slight haze it diffused through the air. Enlarged by this haze, the building they were set to watch rose in magnified proportions at their left. The yard between, piled high in the center with snow heaps or other heaps covered with snow, could not have been more than 40 feet square. The window from which they peered was halfway down this yard, so that a comparatively short distance separated them from the porch where George had been told to look for the man he was expected to identify. All was dark there at present, but he could hear from time to time some sounds of restless movement, as the guard posted inside shifted in his narrow quarters or struck his benumbed feet softly together. But what came to them from above was more interesting than anything to be heard or seen below. A man's voice, raised to a wonderful pitch by the passion of oratory, had burst the barriers of the closed hall in that towering third story, and was carrying its tale to other ears than those within. Had it been summer and the windows open, both George and Sweetwater might have heard every word, for the tones were exceptionally rich and penetrating, and the speaker intent only on the impression he was endeavoring to make upon his audience. That he had not mistaken his power in this direction was evinced by the applause which rose from time to time from innumerable hands and feet. But this uproar would be speedily silenced, and the mellow voice ring out again, clear and commanding. What could the subject be to rouse such enthusiasm in the associated brotherhood of the awl, the plane, and the trowel? There was a moment when our listening friends expected to be enlightened. A shutter was thrown back in one of those upper windows, and the window hurriedly raised, during which words took the place of sounds, and they heard enough to whet their appetite for more. But only that. The shutter was speedily restored to place, and the window again closed. A wise precaution, or so thought George, if they wished to keep their doubtful proceedings secret. A tirade against the rich and a loud call to battle could be gleaned from the sentences they had heard, but its virulence and pointed attack was not that of a second-rate demagogue or business agent, but of a man whose intellect and culture rang in every tone and informed each sentence. Sweetwater, in whom satisfaction was fast taking the place of impatience and regret, pushed the window to before asking George this question. "Did you hear the voice of the man whose action attracted your attention outside the Clermont?" "No." "Did you note just now the large shadow dancing on the ceiling over the speaker's head?" "Yes, but I could judge nothing from that." "Well, he's a rum one. I shan't open this window again till he gives sign of reaching the end of his speech. It's too cold." But almost immediately he gave a start and, pressing George's arm, appeared to listen, not to the speech which was no longer audible, but to something much nearer, a step or movement in the adjoining yard. At least, so George interpreted the quick turn which this impetuous detective made, and the pains he took to direct George's attention to the walk running under the window beneath which they crouched. Some one was stealing down upon the house at their left, from the alley beyond. A big man, whose shoulder brushed the window as he went by. George felt his hand seized again and pressed as this happened, and before he had recovered from this excitement, experienced another quick pressure, and still another, as 1, 2, 3 additional figures went slipping by. Then his hand was suddenly dropped, for a cry had shot up from the door where the sentinels stood guard, followed by a sudden loud slam, and the noise of a shooting bolt, which, proclaiming as it did that the invaders were not friends, but enemies to the cause which was being vaunted above, so excited Sweetwater that he pulled the window wide open and took a bold look out. George followed his example, and this was what they saw. 3 men were standing flat against the fence leading from the shed directly to the porch. The 4th was crouching within the ladder, and in another moment they heard his fist descend upon the door inside in a way to rouse the echoes. Meantime the voice in the audience hall above had ceased, and there could be heard instead the scramble of hurrying feet and the noise of overturning benches. Then a window flew up and a voice called down. "Who's that? What do you want down there?" But before an answer could be shouted back, this man was drawn fiercely inside, and the scramble was renewed, amid which George heard Sweetwater's whisper at his ear. "It's the police! The chief has got ahead of me! Was that the man we're after, the one who shouted down?" No, neither was he the speaker. The voices are very different. We want the speaker. If the boys get him, we're all right. But if they don't, wait, I must make the matter sure. And with a bound he vaulted through the window, whistling in a peculiar way. George, thus left quite alone, had the pleasure of seeing his sole protector mix with the boys, as he called them, and ultimately crowd in with them through the door which had finally been opened for their admittance. Then came a wait, and then the quiet reappearance of the detective, alone and in no very amiable mood. "Well?" inquired George, somewhat breathlessly. "Do you want me? They don't seem to be coming out." "No, they've gone the other way. It was a red-hot anarchist meeting, and no mistake. They have arrested one of the speakers, but the other escaped. How, we have not yet found out, but I think there's a way out somewhere by which he got the start of us. He was the man I wanted you to see. Bad luck, Mr. Anderson, but I'm not at the end of my resources. If you'll have patience with me and accompany me a little further, I promise you that I'll only risk one more failure. Will you be so good, sir?" End of Chapter 8. Recorded by Renata McLaughlin at renatamcl@yahoo.com. Temecula, California, September 20th, 2008. Chapter 9 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Renata McLaughlin. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Chapter 9. The Incident of the Partly Lifted Shade. The fellow had a way with him, hard to resist. Cold as George was, and exhausted by an excitement of a kind to which he was wholly unaccustomed, he found himself acceding to the detective's request, and after a quick lunch and a huge cup of coffee in a restaurant, which I wish I had time to describe, the two took a car which eventually brought them into one of the oldest quarters of the borough of Brooklyn. The sleet which had stung their faces in the streets of New York had been left behind them somewhere on the bridge, but the chill was not gone from the air, and George felt greatly relieved when Sweetwater paused in the middle of a long block before a lofty tenement house of mean appearance, and signified that here they were to stop, and that from now on "Mum" was to be their watchword. George was relieved, I say, but he was also more astonished than ever. What kind of haunts were these for the cultured gentleman who spent his evenings at the Claremont? It was easy enough in these days of extravagant sympathies to understand such a man addressing the uneasy spirits of lower New York. He had been called an enthusiast, and an enthusiast is very often a social agitator, but to trace him afterwards to a place like this was certainly a surprise. A tenement, such a tenement as this, meant home, home for himself or for those he counted his friends, and such a supposition seemed inconceivable to my poor husband, with the memory of the gorgeous parlor of the Claremont in his mind. Indeed, he hinted something of the kind to his affable but strangely reticent companion, but all the answer he got was a peculiar smile whose humorous twist he could barely discern in the semi-darkness of the open doorway into which they had just plunged. "An adventure! Certainly an adventure!" flashed through poor George's mind as he peered in great curiosity down the long hall before him into a dismal rear opening into a still more dismal court. It was truly a novel experience for a business man whose philanthropy was carried on entirely by proxy, that is, by his wife. Should he be expected to penetrate into those dark, ill-smelling recesses, or would he be led up the long flights of naked stairs, so feebly illuminated that they gave the impression of extending indefinitely into dimmer and dimmer heights of decay and desolation? Sweetwater seemed to decide for the rear, for, leaving George, he stepped down the hall into the court beyond, where George could see him casting inquiring glances up at the walls above him. Another tenement, similar to the one whose rear end he was contemplating, towered behind, but he paid no attention to that. He was satisfied with the look he had given, and came quickly back, joining George at the foot of the staircase, up which he silently led the way. It was a rude, none too well cared for building, but it seemed respectable enough, and very quiet, considering the mass of people it accommodated. There were marks of poverty everywhere, but no squalor. One flight, two flights, three, and then George's guide stopped, and, looking back at him, made a gesture. It appeared to be one of caution, but when the two came together at the top of the staircase, Sweetwater spoke quite naturally as he pointed out a door in their rear. "That's the room. We'll keep a sharp watch, and when any man, no matter what his dress or appearance, comes up these stairs and turns that way, give him a sharp look. You understand?" "Yes, but—" "Oh, he hasn't come in yet. I took pains to find that out. You saw me go into the court and look up. That was to see if his window was lighted. Well, it wasn't." George felt nonplussed. "But surely," said he, "the gentleman named Brotherson doesn't live here?" "The inventor does." "Oh." But I will explain later." The suppressed excitement contained in these words made George stare. Indeed, he had been wondering for some time at the manner of the detective, which showed a curious mixture of several opposing emotions. Now the fellow was actually in a tremble of hope or impatience, and, not content with listening, he peered every few minutes down the well of the staircase, and when he was not doing that, tramped from end to end of the narrow passageway separating the head of the stairs from the door he had pointed out, like one to whom minutes were hours. All this time he seemed to forget George, who certainly had as much reason as himself for fighting the time long. But when, after some half hour of his tedium and suspense, there rose from below the faint clatter of ascending footsteps, he remembered his meek companion, and, beckoning him to one side, began a studied conversation with him, showing him a notebook in which he had written such phrases as these: "Don't look up till he is fairly in range with the light." "There is nothing to fear. He doesn't know either of us." If it is a face you have seen before, if it is the one we are expecting to see, pull your necktie straight. It's a little on one side." These rather startling injunctions were read by George, with no very perceptible diminution of the uneasiness which it was only natural for him to feel at the oddity of his position. But only the demand last made produced any impression on him. The man they were waiting for was no further up than the second floor, but instinctively George's hand had flown to his necktie, and he was only stopped from its premature rearrangement by a warning look from Sweetwater. "Not unless you know him," whispered the detective, and immediately launched out into an easy talk about some totally different business which George neither understood nor was expected to, I dare say. Suddenly the steps below paused, and George heard Sweetwater draw in his breath in irrepressible dismay, but they were immediately resumed, and presently the head and shoulders of a working man of uncommon proportions appeared in sight on the stairway. George cast him a keen look, and his hand rose doubtfully to his neck and then fell back again. The approaching man was tall, very well proportioned, and easy of carriage, but the face, such of it as could be seen between his cap and the high collar he had pulled up about his ears, conveyed no exact impression to George's mind, and he did not dare to give the signal Sweetwater expected from him. Yet as the man went by with a dark and sidelong glance at them both, he felt his hand rise again, though he did not complete the action, much to his own disgust, and to the evident disappointment of the watchful detective. "You're not sure?" he now heard, oddly interpolated in the stream of half-whispered talk with which the other endeavored to carry off the situation. George shook his head. He could not rid himself of the old impression he had formed of the man in the snow. "Mr. Dunn, a word with you," suddenly spoke up Sweetwater to the man who had just passed them. "That's your name, isn't it?" "Yes, that is my name," was the quiet response, in a voice which was at once rich and resonant, a voice which George knew, the voice of the impassioned speaker he had heard resounding through the sleet as he cowered within hearing in the shed behind the Avenue A tenement. "Who are you who wish to speak to me at so late an hour?" He was returning to them from the door he had unlocked and left slightly ajar. "Well, we are you know what," smiled the ready detective, advancing halfway to greet him. "We're not members of the Associated Brotherhood, but possibly have hopes of being so. At all events, we should like to talk the matter over, if, as you say, it's not too late." "I have nothing to do with the club." "But you spoke before it." "Yes." "Then you can give us some sort of an idea how we are to apply for membership." Mr. Dunn met the concentrated gaze of his two evidently unwelcome visitors with a frankness which dashed George's confidence in himself, but made little visible impression upon his daring companion. "I should rather see you at another time," said he, but his hesitation was inappreciable save to the nicest ear. "If you will allow me to be brief, I will tell you what I know, which is very little." Sweetwater was greatly taken aback. All he had looked for, as he was careful to tell my husband later, was a sufficiently prolonged conversation to enable George to mark and study the workings of the face he was not yet sure of. Nor did the detective feel quite easy at the readiness of his reception, nor any too well pleased to accept the invitation which this man now gave them to enter his room. But he suffered no betrayal of his misgivings to escape him, though he was careful to intimate to George, as they waited in the doorway for the other to light up, that he should not be displeased at his refusal to accompany him further in this adventure, and even advised him to remain in the hall till he received his summons to enter. But George had not come as far as this to back out now, and as soon as he saw Sweetwater advance into the now well lighted interior, he advanced too, and began to look around him. The room, like many others in these old fashioned tenements, had a jog just where the door was, so that on entering they had to take several steps before they could get a full glimpse of its four walls. When they did, both showed surprise. Comfort, if not elegance, confronted them, which impression, however, was immediately lost in the evidences of work, manual as well as intellectual, which were everywhere scattered about. The man who lived here was not only a student, as was evinced by a long wall full of books, but he was an art lover, a musician, an inventor, and an athlete. So much could be learned from the most cursory glance. A more careful one picked up other facts fully as startling and impressive. The books were choice. The invention to all appearance was a practical one, the art of a high order, and the music, such as was in view, of a character of which the nicest taste need not be ashamed. George began to feel quite conscious of the intrusion of which they had been guilty, and was amazed at the ease with which the detective carried himself in the presence of such manifestations of culture and good hard work. He was trying to recall the exact appearance of the figure he had seen stooping in the snowy street 2 nights before, when he found himself staring at the occupant of the room, who had taken up his stand before them and was regarding them while they were regarding the room. He had thrown aside his hat and rid himself of his overcoat, and the fearlessness of his aspect seemed to daunt the hitherto dauntless Sweetwater, who, for the first time in his life perhaps, hunted in vain for words with which to start conversation. Had he made an awful mistake? Was this Mr. Dunn what he seemed, an unknown and careful genius, battling with great odds in his honest struggle to give the world something of value in return for what it had given him? The quick, almost deprecatory glance he darted at George betrayed his dismay, a dismay which George had begun to share, notwithstanding his growing belief that the man's face was not wholly unknown to him, even if he could not recognize it as the one he had seen outside the Claremont. "You seem to have forgotten your errand," came in quiet, if not good-natured sarcasm from their patiently waiting host. "It's the room," muttered Sweetwater, with an attempt at his old-time ease which was not as fully successful as usual. "What an all-fired genius you must be! I never saw the like. And in a tenement house, too! You ought to be in one of those big new studio buildings in New York, where artists be and everything you see is beautiful. You'd appreciate it, you would."
The detective started, George started, at the gleam which answered him from a very uncommon eye. It was a temporary flash, however, and quickly veiled, and the tone in which this Dunn now spoke was anything but an encouraging one. "I thought you were desirous of joining a socialistic fraternity," said he. "A true aspirant for such honors don't care for beautiful things unless all can have them. I prefer my tenement. How is it with you, friends?" Sweetwater found some sort of a reply, though the thing which this man now did must have startled him, as it certainly did George. They were so grouped that a table quite full of anomalous objects stood at the back of their host, and consequently quite beyond their own reach. As Sweetwater began to speak, he whom he had addressed by the name of Dunn drew a pistol from his breast pocket and laid it down barrel towards them on this table top. Then he looked up courteously enough and listened till Sweetwater was done. A very handsome man, but one not to be trifled with in the slightest degree. Both recognized this fact, and George for one began to edge towards the door. "Now I feel easier," remarked the giant, swelling out his chest. He was unusually tall, as well as unusually muscular. "I never like to carry arms, but sometimes it is unavoidable. Damn it, what hands!" He was looking at his home, which certainly showed soil. "Will you pardon me?" he pleasantly apologized, stepping towards a washstand and plunging his hands into the basin. "I cannot think with dirt on me like that. Hey, did you speak?" He turned quickly on George, who had certainly uttered an ejaculation, but receiving no reply went on with his task, completing it with a care and a disregard of their presence which showed him up in still another light. But even his hardihood showed shock when, upon turning round with a brisk "Now I'm ready to talk," he encountered again the clear eye of Sweetwater. For in the person of this none too welcome intruder he saw a very different man from the one upon whom he had just turned his back with so little ceremony, and there appeared to be no good reason for the change. He had not noted in his preoccupation how George, at sight of his stooping figure, had made a sudden significant movement, and if he had, the pulling of a necktie straight would have meant nothing to him. But to Sweetwater it meant everything, and it was in the tone of one fully at ease with himself that he now dryly remarked: "Mr. Brotherson, if you feel quite clean, and if you have sufficiently warmed yourself, I would suggest that we start out at once, unless you prefer to have me share this room with you till the morning." There was silence. Mr. Dunn, thus addressed, attempted no answer, not for a full minute. The two men were measuring each other. George felt that he did not count at all, and they were quite too much occupied with this task to heed the passage of time. To George, who knew little, if anything, of what this silent struggle meant to either, it seemed that the detective stood no show before this Samson of physical strength and intellectual power, backed by a pistol just within reach of his hand. But as George continued to look and saw the figure of the smaller man gradually dilate, while that of the larger, the more potent, and the better guarded, gave unmistakable signs of secret wavering, he slowly changed his mind, and, ranging himself with the detective, waited for the word or words which should explain the situation and render intelligible the triumph gradually becoming visible in the young detective's eyes. But he was not destined to have his curiosity satisfied so far. He might witness and hear, but it was long before he understood. "Brotherson?" repeated their host after the silence had lasted to the breaking point. "Why do you call me that?" "Because it is your name." "You called me Dunn a minute ago." "That is true." "Why Dunn if Brotherson is my name?" "Because you spoke under the name of Dunn at the meeting to-night, and if I don't mistake, that is the name by which you are known here." "And you, by what name are you known?" "It is late to ask, isn't it? But I'm willing to speak it now, and I might not have been so a little earlier in our conversation. I am Detective Sweetwater of the New York Department of Police, and my errand here is a very simple one. Some letters signed by you have been found among the papers of the lady whose mysterious death at the Hotel Clermont is just now occupying the attention of the New York authorities. If you have any information to give which will in any way explain that death, your presence will be welcome at Coroner Heath's office in New York. If you have not, your presence will still be welcome. At all events, I was told to bring you. You will be on hand to accompany me in the morning, I am quite sure, pardoning the unconventional means I have taken to make sure of my man." The humor with which this was said seemed to rob it of anything like attack, and Mr. Brotherson, as we shall hereafter call him, smiled with an odd acceptance of the same, as he responded: "I will go before the police certainly. I haven't much to tell, but what I have is at their service. It will not help you, but I have no secrets. What are you doing?" He bounded towards Sweetwater, who had simply stepped to the window, lifted the shade, and looked across at the opposing tenement. "I wanted to see if it was still snowing," explained the detective with a smile which seemed to strike the other like a blow. "If it was a liberty, please pardon it." Mr. Brotherson drew back. The cold air of self-possession which he now assumed presented such a contrast to the unwarranted heat of the moment before that George wondered greatly over it, and later, when he recapitulated to me the whole story of this night, it was this incident of the lifted shade, together with the emotion it had caused, which he acknowledged as being for him the most inexplicable event of the evening, and the one he was most anxious to hear explained. As this ends our connection with this affair, I will bid you my personal farewell. I have often wished that circumstances had made it possible for me to accompany you through the remaining intricacies of this remarkable case. But you will not lack a suitable guide. End of Chapter 9. Recorded by Renata McLaughlin at renatamcl@yahoo.com, Temecula, California, January 30th, 2009.
Chapter 10. of initials only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2. As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 10. A Difference of Opinion. At an early hour the next morning, Sweetwater stood before the coroner's desk, urging a plea he feared to hear refused. He wished to be present at the interview soon to be held with Mr. Brotherson, and he had no good reason to advance why such a privilege should be allotted him. "It's not curiosity," said he. "There's a question I hope to see settled. I can't communicate it. You would laugh at me, but it's an important one, a very important one, and I beg that you will let me sit in one of the corners and hear what he says. I won't bother, and I'll be very still, so still that he'll hardly notice me. Do grant me this favour, sir." The coroner, who had some little experience with this man, surveyed him with a smile less forbidding than the poor fellow expected. "You seem to lay great store by it," said he. "If you want to sort those papers over there, you may." "Thank you. I don't understand the job, but I promise you not to increase the confusion. If I do, if I rattle the leaves too loudly, it will mean, press him further on this exact point. But I doubt if I rattle them, sir. No such luck." The last three words were uttered sotto voce, but the coroner heard him, and followed his ungainly figure with a glance of some curiosity, as he settled himself at the desk on the other side of the room. "Is the man—" he began, but at this moment the man entered, and Dr. Heath forgot the young detective, in his interest in the new arrival. Neither dressed with the elegance known to the habitués of the Clermont, nor yet in the workman's outfit in which he had thought best to appear before the Associated Brotherhood, the newcomer advanced, with an aspect of open respect which could not fail to make a favourable impression upon the critical eye of the official awaiting him. So favourable, indeed, was this impression, that that gentleman half rose, infusing a little more consideration into his greeting than he was accustomed to show to his prospective witnesses. Such a fearless eye he had seldom encountered, nor was it often his pleasure to confront so conspicuous a specimen of physical and intellectual manhood. "Mr. Brotherson, I believe," said he, as he motioned his visitor to sit. "That is my name, sir." "Orlando Brotherson?" "The same, sir." "I'm glad we have made no mistake," smiled the doctor. "Mr. Brotherson, I have sent for you under the supposition that you were a friend of the unhappy lady lately dead at the Hotel Clermont, Miss Challoner?" "Certainly, Miss Challoner." "I knew the lady." But here the speaker's eye took on a look as questioning as that of his interlocutor, but in a way so devoid of all publicity that I cannot but feel surprised that the fact should be known. At this, the listening Sweetwater hoped that Dr. Heath would ignore the suggestion thus conveyed and decline the explanation it apparently demanded. But the impression made by the gentleman's good looks had been too strong for this coroner's proverbial caution, and, handing over the slip of a note which had been found among Miss Challoner's effects by her father, he quietly asked: Do you recognize the signature?" "Yes, it is mine." "Then you acknowledge yourself the author of these lines?" "Most certainly. Have I not said that this is my signature?" "Do you remember the words of this note, Mr. Brotherson?" "Hardly. I recollect its tenor, but not the exact words." "Read them." "Excuse me, I had rather not. I am aware that they were bitter and should be the cause of great regret. I was angry when I wrote them." "That is evident. But the cause of your anger is not so clear, Mr. Brotherson. Miss Challoner was a woman of lofty character, or such was the universal opinion of her friends. What could she have done to a gentleman like yourself to draw forth such a tirade?" "You ask that?" "I am obliged to. There is a mystery surrounding her death, the kind of mystery which demands perfect frankness on the part of all who were near her on that evening, or whose relations to her were in any way peculiar." "You acknowledge that your friendship was of such a guarded nature that it surprised you greatly to hear it recognized. Yet you could write her a letter of this nature. Why?" "Because—" The word came glibly, but the next one was long in following. "Because," he repeated, letting the fire of some strong feeling disturb for a moment his dignified reserve. "I offered myself to Miss Challoner, and she dismissed me with great disdain." "Ah, and so you thought a threat was due her?" "A threat? These words contain a threat, do they not?" "They may. I was hardly master of myself at the time. I may have expressed myself in an unfortunate manner." "Read the words, Mr. Brotherson. I really must insist that you do so." There was no hesitancy now. Rising, he leaned over the table and read the few words the other had spread out for his perusal. Then he slowly rose to his full height, as he answered with some slight display of compunction: "I remember it perfectly now. It is not a letter to be proud of. I hope— Pray finish, Mr. Brotherson." "That you are not seeking to establish a connection between this letter and her violent death. Letters of this sort are often very mischievous, Mr. Brotherson. The harshness with which this is written might easily rouse emotions of a most unhappy nature in the breast of a woman as sensitive as Miss Challoner." "Pardon me, Dr. Heath. I cannot flatter myself so far. You overrate my influence with the lady you name." "You believe, then, that she was sincere in her rejection of your addresses?" A start, too slight to be noted by any one but the watchful Sweetwater, showed that this question had gone home. But the self-poise and mental control of this man were perfect, and in an instant he was facing the coroner again, with a dignity which gave no clue to the disturbance into which his thoughts had just been thrown. Nor was this disturbance apparent in his tones when he made his reply. "I have never allowed myself to think otherwise. I have seen no reason why I should. The suggestion you would convey by such a question is hardly welcome now. I pray you to be careful in your judgment of such a woman's impulses. They often spring from sources not to be sounded even by her dearest friends." "Just. But how cold!" Dr. Heath, eyeing him with admiration rather than sympathy, hesitated how to proceed, while Sweetwater, peering up from his papers, sought in vain for some evidence of the bereaved lover in the impressive but wholly dispassionate figure of him who had just spoken. Had pride got the better of his heart? Or had that organ always been subordinate to the will in this man of instincts so varying, that at one time he impressed you simply as a typical gentleman of leisure, at another as no more than a fiery agitator with powers absorbed by, if not limited to the one cause he advocated, and again, and this seemed the most contradictory of all, just the ardent inventor, living in a tenement, with science for his goddess and work always under his hand. As the young detective weighed these possibilities and marvelled over the contradictions they offered, he forgot the papers now lying quiet under his hand. He was too interested to remember his own part, something which could not often be said of Sweetwater. Meantime, the coroner had collected his thoughts. With an apology for the extremely personal nature of his inquiry, he asked Mr. Brotherson if he would object to giving him some further details of his acquaintanceship with Miss Challoner, where he first met her, and under what circumstances their friendship had developed. "Not at all," was the ready reply. "I have nothing to conceal in the matter. I only wish that her father were present that he might listen to the recital of my acquaintanceship with his daughter. He might possibly understand her better and regard with more leniency the presumption into which I was led by my ignorance of the pride inherent in great families." "Your wish can very easily be gratified," returned the official, pressing an electric button on his desk. "Mr. Challoner is in the adjoining room." Then, as the door communicating with the room he had mentioned swung ajar, and stood so, Dr. Heath added, without apparent consciousness of the dramatic character of this episode, "You will not need to raise your voice beyond its natural pitch. He can hear perfectly from where he sits." "Thank you. I am glad to speak in his presence," came in undisturbed self possession from this not easily surprised witness. "I shall relate the facts exactly as they occurred, adding nothing and concealing nothing. If I mistook my position, or Miss Challoner's position, it is not for me to apologize. I never hid my business from her, nor the moderate extent of my fortune. If she knew me at all, she knew me for what I am, a man of the people who glories in work, and who has risen by it to a position somewhat unique in this city. I feel no lack of equality even with such a woman as Miss Challoner." A most unnecessary preamble, no doubt, and of doubtful efficiency in smoothing his way to a correct understanding with the deeply bereaved father. But he looked so handsome as he thus asserted himself, and made so much of his inches and the noble poise of his head, though cold of eye and always cold of manner, that those who saw, as well as heard him, forgave this display of egotism in consideration of its honesty and the dignity it imparted to his person. "I first met Miss Challoner in the Berkshires," he began, after a moment of quiet listening for any possible sound from the other room. "I had been on the tramp, and had stopped at one of the great hotels for a 7 days' rest. I will acknowledge that I chose this spot at the instigation of a relative who knew my tastes and how perfectly they might be gratified there. That I should mingle with the guests may not have been in his thought, any more than it was in mine at the beginning of my stay. The panorama of beauty spread out before me on every side was sufficient in itself for my enjoyment, and might have continued so to the end if my attention had not been very forcibly drawn on one memorable morning to a young lady, Miss Challoner, by the very earnest look she gave me as I was crossing the office from one veranda to another. I must insist on this look, even if it shock the delicacy of my listeners, for without the interest it awakened in me, I might not have noticed the blush with which she turned aside to join her friends on the veranda. It was an overwhelming blush, which could not have sprung from any slight embarrassment, and, though I hate the pretensions of those egotists who see in a woman's smile more than it by right conveys, I could not help being moved by this display of feeling in one so gifted with every grace and attribute of the perfect woman. With less caution than I usually display, I approached the desk where she had been standing and, meeting the eyes of the clerk, asked the young lady's name. He gave it, and waited for me to express the surprise he expected it to evoke. But I felt none and showed none. Other feelings had seized me. I had heard of this gracious woman from many sources, in my life among the suffering masses of New York, and now that I had seen her and found her to be not only my ideal of personal loveliness, but seemingly approachable and not uninterested in myself, I allowed my fancy to sour and my heart to become touched. A fact which the clerk now confided to me naturally deepened the impression. Miss Challoner had seen my name in the guest book, and asked to have me pointed out to her. Perhaps she had heard my name spoken in the same quarter where I had heard hers. We have never exchanged confidences on the subject, and I cannot say. I can only give you my reason for the interest I felt in Miss Challoner and why I forgot, in the glamour of this episode, the aims and purposes of a not unambitious life, and the distance which the world and the so-called aristocratic class put between a woman of her wealth and standing and a simple worker like myself. I must be pardoned. She had smiled upon me once, and she smiled again. Days before we were formally presented, I caught her softened look turned my way, as we passed each other in hall or corridor. We were friends, or so it appeared to me, before ever a word passed between us, and when fortune favoured us and we were duly introduced, our minds met in a strange sympathy which made this one interview a memorable one to me. Unhappily, as I then considered it, this was my last day at the hotel, and our conversation, interrupted frequently by passing acquaintances, was never resumed. I exchanged a few words with her by way of good-bye, but nothing more. I came to New York, and she remained in Lenox. A month after, and she too came to New York. This good-bye, do you remember it? The exact language, I mean. I do. It made a great impression on me. I shall hope for our further acquaintance, she said. We have one very strong interest in common. And if ever a human face spoke eloquently, it was hers at that moment. The interest, as I understood it, was our mutual sympathy for our toiling, half-starved, downtrodden brothers and sisters in the lower streets of this city, but the eloquence that I probably mistook. I thought it sprung from personal interest, and it gave me courage to pursue the intention which had taken the place of every other feeling and ambition by which I had hitherto been moved. Here was a woman in 1,000, one who could make a man of me indeed. If she could ignore the social gulf between us, I felt free to take the leap. Cowardice had never been a fault of mine, but I was no fool even then. I realized that I must first let her see the manner of man I was, and what life meant to me and must mean to her if the union I contemplated should come an actual fact. I wrote letters to her, but I did not give her my address or even request a reply. I was not ready for any word from her. I am not like other men, and I could wait. And I did, for weeks. Then I suddenly appeared at her hotel. The change of voice, the bitterness which he infused into this final sentence made every one look up. Hitherto he had spoken calmly, almost monotonously, as if no present heart-beat responded to this tale of vanished love. But with the words, "Then I suddenly appeared at her hotel," he showed himself human again, and betrayed a passion which, though curbed, was of the fiery quality befitting his extraordinary attributes of mind and person. "This was when," put in Dr. Heath, anxious to bridge the pause which must have been very painful to the listening father. "The week after Thanksgiving. I did not see her the first day, and only casually the second, but she knew I was in the building, and when I came upon her one evening seated at the very desk in the mezzanine which we all have such bitter cause to remember, I could not forbear expressing myself in a way she could not misunderstand. The result was of a kind to drive a man like myself to an extremity of self-condemnation and rage. She rose up as if insulted, and flung me one sentence and one sentence only before she hailed the elevator and left my presence. A cur could not have been dismissed with less ceremony. "That is not like my daughter." "What was the sentence you allude to?" "Let me hear the very words." Mr. Challoner had come forward, and now stood awaiting his reply, a dignified but pathetic figure which all must view with respect. "I hate the memory of them, but since you demand it, I will repeat them just as they fell from her lips," was Mr. Brotherson's bitter retort. She said, "You of all men should recognise the unseemliness of these proposals. Had your letters given me any hint of the feelings you have just expressed, you would never have had this opportunity of approaching me." That was all, but her indignation was scathing. Ladies who have supped exclusively off silver show a fine scorn for the common ware of the cottager. Mr. Challoner bowed. "There is some mistake," said he. "My daughter might be averse to your addresses, but she would never show indignation to any aspirant for her hand, simply on account of extraneous conditions. She had wide sympathies, wider than I often approved. Something in the conduct or the confidence you showed shocked her nicer sense, not your lack of the luxuries she often misprized. This much I feel obliged to say, out of justice to her character, which was uniformly considerate." "You have seen her with men of her own world and yours," was the harsh response. "She had another side to her nature for the man of a different sphere." "And it killed my love. That you can see, and led her to my sending her the injudicious letter with which you have confronted me. The hurt bull utters one bellow before he dies. I bellowed, and bellowed loudly, but I did not die. I'm my own man still and mean to remain so." The assertive boldness, some would call it bravado, with which he thus finished the story of his relations with the dead heiress, seemed to be more than Mr. Challoner could stand. With a look of extreme pain and perplexity he vanished from the doorway, and it fell to Dr. Heath to inquire: "Is this letter a letter of threat? You will remember the only communication which passed between you and Miss Challoner after this unfortunate passage of arms at the Clermont?" "Yes. I had no wish to address her again. I had exhausted in this one outburst whatever humiliation I felt." "And she? Did she give no sign, make you no answer?" "None whatever." Then, as if he found it impossible to hide this hurt to his pride, "She did not even seem to consider me worthy the honour of an added rebuke. Such arrogance is, no doubt, commendable in a Challoner." This time his bitterness did not pass unrebuked by the coroner. "Remember the grey hairs of the only Challoner who can hear you, and respect his grief." Mr. Brotherson bowed. "I have finished," said he. "I shall have nothing more to say on the subject," and he drew himself up in expectation of the dismissal he evidently thought pending. But the coroner was not done with him by any means. He had a theory in regard to this lamentable suicide which he hoped to establish by this man's testimony, and, in pursuit of this plan, he not only motioned to Mr. Brotherson to reseat himself, but began at once to open a fresh line of examination by saying: "You will pardon me if I press this matter. I have been given to understand that notwithstanding your break with Miss Challoner, you have kept up your visits to the Clermont, and were even on the spot at the time of her death." "On the spot? In the hotel, I mean." "There you are right. I was in the hotel." "At the time of her death?" "Very near the time. I remember hearing some disturbance in the lobby behind me, just as I was passing out at the Broadway entrance." "You did, and did not return?" "Why should I return? I am not a man of much curiosity. There was no reason why I should connect a sudden alarm in the lobby of the Clermont with any cause of special interest to myself." This was so true, and the look which accompanied the words was so frank, that the coroner hesitated a moment before he said: "Certainly not, unless well, to be direct, unless you had just seen Miss Challoner, and knew her state of mind and what was likely to follow your abrupt departure." "I had no interview with Miss Challoner." "But you saw her?" "Saw her that evening and just before the accident." Sweetwater's papers rattled. It was the only sound to be heard in that moment of silence. "Then, what do you mean by those words?" inquired Mr. Brotherson, with studied composure. "I have said that I had no interview with Miss Challoner. Why do you ask me, then, if I saw her?" "Because I believe that you did. From a distance, possibly, but yet directly, with no possibility of mistake." "Do you put that as a question?" "I do. Did you see her figure or face that night?" "I did." Nothing, not even the rattling of Sweetwater's papers, disturbed the silence which followed this admission. "From where?" Dr. Heath asked at last. "From a point far enough away to make any communication between us impossible. I do not think you will require me to recall the exact spot." "If it were one which made it possible for her to see you as clearly as you could see her, I think it would be very advisable for you to say so." "It was such a spot." "Then I think I can locate it for you. Or do you prefer to locate it yourself?" "I will locate it myself. I had hoped not to be called upon to mention what I cannot but consider a most unfortunate coincidence. As a gentleman, you will understand my reticence and also why it is a matter of regret to me that with an acumen worthy of your position, you should have discovered a fact which, while it cannot explain Miss Challoner's death, will drag our little affair before the public, and possibly give it a prominence in some minds which I am sure does not belong to it. I met Miss Challoner's eye for one instant from the top of the little staircase running up to the mezzanine. I had yielded thus far to an impulse I had frequently combated, to seek by another interview to retrieve the bad effect which must have been made upon her by my angry note. I knew that she frequently wrote letters in the mezzanine at this hour, and got as far as the top of the staircase in my effort to join her, but got no further. When I saw her on her feet, with her face turned my way, I remembered the scorn with which she had received my former heartfelt proposals, and, without taking another step forward, I turned away from her and fled down the steps and so out of the building by the main entrance. She saw me, for her hand flew up with a startled gesture, but I cannot think that my presence on the same floor with her could have caused her to strike the blow which terminated her life. Why should I? No woman sacrifices her life out of mere regret for the disdain she has shown a man she has taken no pains to understand. His tone and his attitude seemed to invite the concurrence of Dr. Heath in this statement, but the richness of the one and the grace of the other showed the handsome speaker off to such advantage that the coroner was rather inclined to consider how a woman, even of Miss Challoner's fine taste and careful breeding, might see in such a situation much for regret, if not for active despair and the suicidal act. He gave no evidence of his thought, however, but followed up the one admission made by Mr. Brotherson, which he and others must naturally view as of the first importance. You saw Miss Challoner lift her hand, you say. Which hand? And what was in it? Anything? She lifted her right hand, but it would be impossible for me to tell you whether there was anything in it or not. I simply saw the movement before I turned away. It looked like one of alarm to me. I felt that she had some reason for this. She could not know that it was in repentance I came rather than in fulfilment of my threat. A sigh from the adjoining room. Mr. Brotherson rose as he heard it, and in doing so met the clear eye of Sweetwater fixed upon his own. Its language was, no doubt, peculiar, and it seemed to fascinate him for a moment, for he started as if to approach the detective, but forsook this intention almost immediately, and addressing the coroner, gravely remarked: "Her death following so quickly upon this abortive attempt of mine at an interview startled me by its coincidence as much as it does you. If in the weakness of her woman's nature it was more than this, if the scorn she had previously shown me was a cloak she instinctively assumed to hide what was she not ready to disclose, my remorse will be as great as anyone here could wish. But the proof of all this will have to be very convincing before my present convictions will yield to it. Some other and more poignant source will have to be found for that instant's impulsive act than is supplied by this story of my unfortunate attachment." Dr. Heath was convinced, but he was willing to concede something to the secret demand made upon him by Sweetwater, who was bundling up his papers with much clatter. Looking up with a smile which had elements in it he was hardly conscious of perhaps himself. he asked in an offhand way. "Then why did you take such pains to wash your hands of the affair the moment you had left the hotel?" "I do not understand." "You passed around the corner into street, did you not?" "Very likely. I could go that way as well as another." "And stopped at the first lamp post?" "Oh, I see. Someone saw that childish action of mine." "What do you mean by it?" "Just what you have suggested. I did go through the pantomime of washing my hands of an affair I considered definitely ended. I had resisted an irrepressible impulse to see and talk with Miss Challoner again, and was pleased with my firmness, unaware of the tragic blow which had just fallen. I was full of self congratulations at my escape from the charm which had lured me back to this hotel again and again in spite of my better judgment, and I wished to symbolize my relief by an act of which I was, in another moment, ashamed. Strange that there should have been a witness to it." Here he stole a look at Sweetwater. "Stranger still, that circumstances by the most extraordinary of coincidences should have given so unforeseen a point to it." "You are right, Mr. Brotherson. The whole occurrence is startling and most strange. But life is made up of the unexpected, as none know better than we physicians, whether our practice be of a public or private character." As Mr. Brotherson left the room, the curiosity to which he had yielded once before led him to cast a glance of penetrating inquiry behind him full at Sweetwater, and if either felt embarrassment, it was not the hunted but the hunter. But the feeling did not last. "I've simply met the strongest man I've ever encountered," was Sweetwater's encouraging comment to himself. "All the more glory if I can find a joint in his armour or a hidden passage to his cold, secretive heart." End of chapter 10.
Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Anna Roberts. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2. As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 11. Alike in Essentials. "Mr. Gryce, I am either a fool or the luckiest fellow going. You must decide which." The aged detective thus addressed laid down his evening paper and endeavored to make out the dim form he could just faintly discern, standing between him and the library door. "Sweetwater, is that you?" "No one else. Sweetwater the fool, or Sweetwater, much too wise for his own good. I don't know which. Perhaps you can find out and tell me." A grunt from the region of the library table, then the sarcastic remark, "I'm just in the mood to settle that question. This last failure to my account ought to make me an excellent judge of another's folly. I've meddled with the old business for the last time, Sweetwater. You'll have to go it alone from now on. The department has no more work for Ebenezer Gryce, or rather, Ebenezer Gryce will make no more fool attempts to please them. Strange, that a man doesn't know when his time has come to quit. I remember how I once scored Yardsley for hanging on after he had lost his grip, and here am I doing the same thing. But what's the matter with you? Speak out, my boy. Something new in the wind?" "No, Mr. Gryce, nothing new. It's the same old business. But, if what I suspect is true, this same old business offers opportunities for some very interesting and unusual effort. You're not satisfied with the coroner's verdict in the Challoner case?" "No, I'm satisfied with nothing that leaves all ends dangling. Suicide was not proved. It seemed the only presumption possible, but it was not proved. There was no blood stain on that cutter point." "Nor any evidence that it had ever been there." "No. I'm not proud of the chain which lacks a link where it should be strongest." "We shall never supply that link." "I quite agree with you." "That chain we must throw away." "And forge another?" Sweetwater approached and sat down. Yes, I believe we can do it. Yet I have only one indisputable fact for a starter. That is why I want you to tell me whether I'm growing daft, or simply adventurous. Mr. Gryce, I don't trust Brotherson. He has pulled the wool over Dr. Heath's eyes, and almost over those of Mr. Challoner. But he can't pull it over mine. Though he should tell a story 10 times more plausible than the one with which he has satisfied the coroner's jury, I would still listen to him with more misgiving than confidence. Yet I have caught him in no misstatement, and his eye is steadier than my own. Perhaps it is simply a deeply rooted antipathy on my part, or the rage one feels at finding he has placed his finger on the wrong man. Again, it may be— What, Sweetwater? A well-founded distrust. Mr. Gryce, I'm going to ask you a question. Ask away. Ask 50 if you want to. No, the one may involve 50, but it is big enough in itself to hold our attention for a while. Did you ever hear of a case before that in some of its details was similar to this? No, it stands alone. That's why it is so puzzling. You forget. The wealth, beauty, and social consequence of the present victim has blinded you to the strong resemblance which her case bears to one you know, in which the sufferer had none of the worldly advantages of Miss Challoner. I allude to— Wait! The washerwoman in Hicks Street? Sweetwater, what have you got up your sleeve? You do mean that Brooklyn washerwoman, don't you? The same. The department may have forgotten it, but I haven't. Mr. Gryce, there's a startling similarity in the two cases if you study the essential features only. Startling, I assure you. Yes, you are right there. But what if there is? We were no more successful in solving that case than we have been in solving this. Yet you look and act like a hound which has struck a hot scent. The young man smoothed his features with an embarrassed laugh. I shall never learn, said he, not to give tongue till the hunt is fairly started. If you will excuse me, we'll first make sure of the similarity I have mentioned, then I'll explain myself. I have some notes here, made at the time it was decided to drop the Hicks Street case as a wholly inexplicable one. As you know, I never can bear to say die, and I sometimes keep such notes as a possible help, in case any such unfinished matter should come up again. Shall I read them? Do. 20 years ago it would not have been necessary. I should have remembered every detail of an affair so puzzling. But my memory is no longer entirely reliable. So fire away, my boy, though I hardly see your purpose, or what real bearing the affair in Hicks Street has upon the Claremont one. A poor washerwoman, and the wealthy Miss Challoner. True, they were not unlike in their end. The connection will come later, smiled the young detective, with that strange softening of his features which made one at times forget his extreme plainness. I'm sure you will not consider the time lost if I ask you to consider the comparison I am about to make, if only as a curiosity in criminal annals. And he read: On the afternoon of December 4th, 1910, the strong and persistent screaming of a young child in one of the rooms of a rear tenement in Hicks Street, Brooklyn, drew the attention of some of the inmates, and led them, after several ineffectual efforts to gain an entrance, to the breaking in of the door which had been fastened on the inside by an old-fashioned door-button. The tenant, whom all knew for an honest, hard-working woman, had not infrequently fastened her door in this manner, in order to safeguard her child, who was abnormally active, and had a way of rattling the door open when it was not thus secured. But she had never refused to open before, and the child's cries were pitiful. This was no longer a matter of wonder, when, the door having been wrenched from its hinges, they all rushed in. Across a tub of steaming clothes, lifted upon a bench in the open window, they saw the body of this good woman, lying inert and seemingly dead, the frightened child tugging at her skirts. She was of a robust make, fleshy and fair, and had always been considered a model of health and energy, but at the sight of her helpless figure, thus stricken while at work, the one cry was, "A stroke!" till she had been lifted off and laid upon the floor. Then some discoloration in the water at the bottom of the tub led to a closer examination of her body, and the discovery of a bullet hole in her breast, directly over the heart. As she had been standing with face towards the window, all crowded that way to see where the shot had come from. As they were on the 4th story, it could not have come from the court upon which the room looked. It could only have come from the front tenement, towering up before them some 20 feet away. A single window of the innumerable ones confronting them stood open, and this was the one directly opposite. Nobody was to be seen there or in the room beyond, but during the excitement one man ran off to call the police, and another to hunt up the janitor and ask who occupied this room. His reply threw them all into confusion. The tenant of that room was the best, the quietest, and most respectable man in either building. Then he must be simply careless, and the shot an accidental one. A rush was made for the stairs, and soon the whole building was in an uproar. But when this especial room was reached, it was found locked, and on the door a paper pinned up, on which these words were written: "Gone to New York, will be back at 6:30." Words that recalled a circumstance to the janitor. He had seen the gentleman go out an hour before. This terminated all inquiry in this direction, though some few of the excited throng were for battering down this door just as they had the other one. But they were overruled by the janitor, who saw no use in such wholesale destruction, and presently the arrival of the police restored order and limited the inquiry to the rear building, where it undoubtedly belonged. Mr. Gryce here Sweetwater laid by his notes that he might address the old gentleman more directly. "I was with the boys when they made their first official investigation. This is why you can rely upon the facts as here given. I followed the investigation closely, and missed nothing which could in any way throw light on the case. It was a mysterious one from the first, and lost nothing by further inquiry into the details. The first fact to startle us as we made our way up through the crowd which blocked halls and staircases was this. A doctor had been found, and, though he had been forbidden to make more than a cursory examination of the body till the coroner came, he had not hesitated to declare, after his first look, that the wound had not been made by a bullet, but by some sharp and slender weapon thrust home by a powerful hand. You mark that, Mr. Gryce. As this seemed impossible in the face of the fact that the door had been found buttoned on the inside, we did not give much credit to his opinion, and began our work under the obvious theory of an accidental discharge of some gun from one of the windows across the court. But the doctor was nearer right than we supposed. When the coroner came to look into the matter, he discovered that the wound was not only too small to have been made by the ordinary bullet, but that there was no bullet to be found in the woman's body or anywhere else. Her heart had been reached by a thrust, and not by a shot from a gun. Mr. Gryce, have you not heard a startling repetition of this report in a case nearer at hand? But to go back. This discovery, so important if true, was as yet, that is at the time of our entering the room, limited to the offhand declaration of an irresponsible physician, but the possibility it involved was of so astonishing a nature that it influenced us unconsciously in our investigation and led us almost immediately into a consideration of the difficulties attending an entrance into, as well as an escape from, a room situated as this was. Up 3 flights from the court, with no communication with the adjoining rooms save through a door guarded on both sides by heavy pieces of furniture no one person could handle, the hall door buttoned on the inside, and the fire escape some 15 feet to the left, this room of death appeared to be as removed from the approach of a murderous outsider as the spot in the writing room of the Claremont where Miss Challoner fell. Otherwise the place presented the greatest contrast possible to that scene of splendor and comfort. I had not entered the Claremont at that time, and no such comparison could have struck my mind. But I have thought of it since, and you, with your experience, will not find it difficult to picture the room where this poor woman lived and worked. Bare walls, with just a newspaper illustration pinned up here and there, a bed, tragically occupied at this moment, a kitchen stove on which a boiler, half filled with steaming clothes, still bubbled and foamed, an old bureau, a large pine wardrobe against an inner door which we later found to have been locked for months, and the key lost, some chairs, and most pronounced of all, because of its position directly before the window, a pine bench supporting a wash-tub of the old sort. As it was here the woman fell, this tub naturally received the closest examination. A board projected from its further side, whither it had evidently been pushed by the weight of her falling body, and from its top hung a wet cloth, marking with its lugubrious drip on the boards beneath the first heavy moments of silence, which is the natural accompaniment of so serious a survey. On the floor to the right lay a half-used cake of soap, just as it had slipped from her hand. The window was closed, for the temperature was at the freezing point, but it had been found up, and it was put up now to show the height at which it had then stood. As we all took our look at the house wall opposite, a sound of shouting came up from below. A dozen children were sliding on barrel staves down a slope of heaped-up snow. They had been engaged in this sport all the afternoon, and were our witnesses later that no one had made a hazardous escape, by means of the ladder of the fire escape, running, as I have said, at an almost unattainable distance toward the left. Of her own child, whose cries had roused the neighbors, nothing was to be seen. The woman in the extreme rear had carried it off to her room, but when we came to see it later, no doubt was felt by any of us that this child was too young to talk connectedly, nor did I ever hear that it ever said anything which could in any way guide investigation. And that is as far as we ever got. The coroner's jury brought in a verdict of death by means of a stab from some unknown weapon in the hand of a person also unknown, but no weapon was ever found, nor was it ever settled how the attack could have been made or the murderer escape under the conditions described. The woman was poor, her friends few, and the case seemingly inexplicable. So, after creating some excitement by its peculiarities, it fell of its own weight. But I remembered it, and in many a spare hour have tried to see my way through the no thoroughfare it presented, but quite in vain. To-day the road is as blind as ever, but—" Here Sweetwater's face sharpened, and his eyes burned as he leaned closer and closer to the old detective. "But this second case, so unlike the first in non-essentials, but so exactly like it in just those points which make the mystery, has dropped a thread from its tangled skein into my hand, which may yet lead us to the heart of both. Can you guess, have you guessed, what this thread is? But how could you without the one clue I have not given you? Mr. Gryce, the tenement where this occurred is the same I visited the other night in search of Mr. Brotherson, and the man characterized at that time by the janitor as the best, the quietest, and most respectable tenant in the whole building, and the one, you remember, whose window opened directly opposite the spot where this woman lay dead, was Mr. Dunn himself, or, in other words, our late redoubtable witness, Mr. Orlando Brotherson." End of chapter 11. Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Anna Roberts. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2. As Seen by Detective Clearwater. Chapter 12. Mr. Gryce Finds an Antidote for Old Age. "I thought I should make you sit up. I really calculated upon doing so, sir. Yes, I have established the plain fact that this Brotherson was near to, if not in the exact line of the scene of crime, in each of these extraordinary and baffling cases. A very odd coincidence, is it not?" was the dry conclusion of our eager young detective. "Odd enough if you are correct in your statement. But I thought it was conceded that the man Brotherson was not personally near, was not even in the building at the time of the woman's death in Hicks Street, that he was out and had been out for hours, according to the janitor." "And so the janitor thought, but he didn't quite know his man. I'm not sure that I do, but I mean to make his acquaintance, and make it thoroughly, before I let him go. The hero—well, I will say the possible hero of two such adventures, deserves some attention from one so interested in the abnormal as myself. Sweetwater, how came you to discover that Mr. Dunn of this ramshackle tenement in Hicks Street was identical with the elegantly equipped admirer of Miss Challoner?" "Just this way. The night before Miss Challoner's death I was brooding very deeply over the Hicks Street case. It had so possessed me that I had taken the street in on my way from Flatbush, as if staring at the house in its swarming courtyard was going to settle any such question as that. I walked by the place and I looked up at the windows. No inspiration. Then I sauntered back and entered the house with the full intention of crossing the courtyard and wandering into the rear building where the crime had occurred. But my attention was diverted and my mind changed by seeing a man coming down the stairs before me, of so fine a figure that I involuntarily stopped to look at him. Had he moved a little less carelessly, had he worn his workman's clothes a little less naturally, I should have thought him some college-bred man out on a slumming expedition. But he was entirely too much at home where he was, and too unconscious of his genes for any such conclusion on my part, and when he had passed out I had enough curiosity to ask who he was. My interest, you may believe, was in no wise abated when I learned that he was that highly respectable tenant whose window had been open at the time when half the inmates of the two buildings had rushed up to his door, only to find a paper on it displaying these words, "Gone to New York, will be back at 6:30. Had he returned at that hour? I don't think anybody had ever asked, and what reason had I for such interference now? But an idea once planted in my brain sticks tight, and I kept thinking of this man all the way to the bridge. Instinctively, and quite against my will, I found myself connecting him with some previous remembrance in which I seemed to see his tall form and strong features under the stress of some great excitement. But there my memory stopped, till suddenly, as I was entering the subway, it all came back to me. I had met him the day I went with the boys to investigate the case in Hicks Street. He was coming down the staircase of the rear tenement then, very much as I had just seen him coming down the one in front. Only the Dunn of to-day seemed to have all his wits about him, while the huge fellow who brushed so rudely by me on that occasion had the peculiar look of a man struggling with horror or some other grave agitation. This was not surprising, of course, under the circumstances. I had met more than one man and woman in those halls who had worn the same look, but none of them had put up a sign on his door that he had left for New York and would not be back till 6:30, and then changed his mind so suddenly that he was back in the tenement at 3, sharing the curiosity and the terrors of its horrified inmates. But the discovery, while possibly suggestive, was not of so pressing a nature as to demand instant action, and more immediate duties coming up, I let the matter slip from my mind, to be brought up again the next day, you may well believe, when all the circumstances of the death at the Claremont came to light, and I found myself confronted by a problem very nearly the counterpart of the one then occupying me. But I did not see any real connection between the two cases, until, in my hunt for Mr. Brotherson, I came upon the following facts: that he was not always the gentleman he appeared, that the apartment in which he was supposed to live was not his own but a friend's, and that he was only there by spells. When he was there, he dressed like a prince, and it was while so clothed he ate his meals in the café of the Hotel Claremont. But there were times when he had been seen to leave this apartment in a very different garb, and while there was no one to insinuate that he was slack in paying his debts, or was given to dissipation or any overt vice, it was generally conceded by such as casually knew him, that there was a mysterious side to his life which no one understood. His friend, a seemingly candid and open-minded gentleman, explained these contradictions by saying that Mr. Brotherson was a humanitarian, and spent much of his time in the slums. That while so engaged he naturally dressed to suit the occasion, and if he was to be criticized at all, it was for his zeal, which often led him to extremes and kept him to his task for days, during which time none of his uptown friends saw him. Then this enthusiastic gentleman called him the great intellectual light of the day, and well, if I ever want a character, I shall take pains to insinuate myself into the good graces of this Mr. Conway. Of Brotherson himself I saw nothing. He had come to Mr. Conway's apartment the night before, the night of Miss Challoner's death, you understand, but had remained only long enough to change his clothes. Where he went afterwards is unknown to Mr. Conway, nor can he tell us when to look for his return. When he does show up, my message will be given to him, etc., etc. I have no fault to find with Mr. Conway. But I had an idea in regard to this elusive Brotherson. I had heard enough about him to be mighty sure that together with his other accomplishments he possessed the golden tongue and easy speech of an orator; also that his tendencies were revolutionary, and that for all his fine clothes and hankering after table luxuries and the like, he cherished a spite against wealth, which made his words under certain moods cut like a knife. But there was another man, known to us of the precinct, who had very nearly these same gifts, and this man was going to speak at a secret meeting that very evening. This we had been told by a disgruntled member of the Associated Brotherhood. Suspecting Brotherson, I had this prospective speaker described, and thought I recognized my man, but I wanted to be positive in my identification, so I took Anderson with me, but I'll cut that short. We didn't see the orator, and that go went for nothing. But I had another string to my bow in the shape of the workman Dunn, who also answered to the description which had been given me, so I lugged poor Anderson over into Hicks Street. It was late for the visit I proposed, but not too late if Dunn was also the orator who, surprised by a raid I had not been let into, would be making for his home, if only to establish an alibi. The subway was near, and I calculated on his using it, but we took a taxicab and so arrived in Hicks Street some few minutes before him. The result you know. Anderson recognized the man as the one whom he saw washing his hands in the snow outside of Claremont, and the man, seeing himself discovered, owned himself to be Brotherson, and made no difficulty about accompanying us the next day to the coroner's office. You have heard how he bore himself, what his explanations were, and how completely they fitted in with the preconceived notions of the inspector and the district attorney. In consequence, Miss Challoner's death is looked upon as a suicide, the impulsive act of a woman who sees the man she may have scouted, but whom she secretly loves, turn away from her, in all probability forever. A weapon was in her hand, she impulsively used it, and another deplorable suicide was added to the melancholy list. Had I put in my oar at the conference held in the coroner's office, had I recalled to Dr. Heath the curious case of Mrs. Spots, and then identified Brotherson as the man whose window fronted hers from the opposite tenement, a diversion might have been created and the outcome been different. But I feared the experiment. I'm not sufficiently in with the chief as yet, nor yet with the inspector. They might not have called me a fool. You may, but that's different. And they might have listened, but it would doubtless have been with an air I could not have held up against, with that fellow's eyes fixed mockingly on mine. For he and I are pitted for a struggle, and I do not want to give him the advantage of even a momentary triumph. He's the most complete master of himself of any man I ever met, and it will take the united brain and resolution of the whole force to bring him to book, if he is ever brought to book, which I doubt. What do you think about it?" "That you have given me an antidote against old age," was the ringing and unexpected reply, as the thoughtful, half-puzzled aspect of the old man yielded impulsively to a burst of his early enthusiasm. "If we can get a good grip on the thread you speak of, and can work ourselves along by it, though it be by no more than an inch at a time, we shall yet make our way through this labyrinth of undoubted crime, and earn for ourselves a triumph which will make some of these raw and inexperienced young fellows about us stare. Sweetwater, coincidences are possible. We run upon them every day. But coincidence in crime? That should make work for a detective, and we are not afraid of work. There's my hand for the end of the business." "And here's mine." Next minute the two heads were closer than ever together, and the business had begun. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2, As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 13, Time, Circumstance, and a Villain's Heart. Our first difficulty is this. We must prove motive. Now, I do not think it will be so very hard to show that this Brotherson cherished feelings of revenge towards Miss Challoner. But I have to acknowledge right here and now that the most skillful and vigorous pumping of the janitor and such other tenants of the Hicks Street tenement as I have dared to approach fails to show that he has ever held any communication with Mrs. Spotts, or even knew of her existence until her remarkable death attracted his attention. I have spent all the afternoon over this, and with no result. A complete break in the chain at the very start. Humph! We must set that down, then, as so much against us. The next, and this is a bitter pill too, is the almost insurmountable difficulty already recognized of determining how a man, without approaching his victim, could manage to inflict a mortal stab in her breast. No cloak of complete invisibility has yet been found, even by the cleverest criminals. True. The problem is such as a nightmare offers. For years my dreams have been haunted by a gnome who proposes just such puzzles. But there's an answer to everything, and I'm sure there's an answer to this. Remember his business. He's an inventor with startling ideas. So much I've seen for myself. You may stretch probabilities a little in his case, and with this conceded, we may add by way of offset to the difficulties you mention, coincidences of time and circumstance, and his villainous heart. Oh, I know that I am prejudiced, but wait and see. Miss Challoner was well rid of him, even at the cost of her life. She loved him. Even her father believes that now. Some lately discovered letters have come to light to prove that she was by no means so heart-free as he supposed. One of her friends, it seems, has also confided to him that once, while she and Miss Challoner were sitting together, she caught Miss Challoner in the act of scribbling capitals over a sheet of paper. They were all B's, with the exception of here and there a neatly turned O, and when her friend twitted her with her fondness for these two letters, and suggested a pleasing monogram, Miss Challoner answered O.B., transferring the letters, as you see, as the initials of the finest man in the world. Gosh! Has he heard this story? Who? The gentleman in question. Mr. Brotherson? Yes. I don't think so. It was told me in confidence. Told you, Mr. Gryce? Pardon my curiosity. By Mr. Challoner. Oh, by Mr. Challoner. He is greatly distressed at having the disgraceful suggestion of suicide attached to his daughter's name. Notwithstanding the circumstances, notwithstanding his full recognition of her secret predilection for a man of whom he had never heard till the night of her death, he cannot believe that she struck the blow she did intentionally. He sent for me in order to inquire if anything could be done to reinstate her in public opinion. He dared not insist that another had wielded the weapon which laid her low so suddenly, but he asked if, in my experience, it had never been known that a woman, hypersensitive to some strong man's magnetic influence, should so follow his thought as to commit an act which never could have arisen in her own mind uninfluenced. He evidently does not like Brotherson either. And what did you say? Asked Sweetwater. with a halting utterance and his face full of thought. "I simply quoted the latest authority on hypnotism, that no person even in hypnotic sleep could be influenced by another to do what was antagonistic to his natural instincts." "Latest authority? That doesn't mean a final one. Supposing that it was hypnotism. But that wouldn't account for Mrs. Spot's death. Her wound certainly was not a self-inflicted one." "How can you be sure?" "There was no weapon found in the room or in the court. The snow was searched, and the children too. No weapon, Mr. Gryce, not even a paper cutter. Besides But how did Mr. Challoner take what you said? Was he satisfied with this assurance?" "He had to be. I didn't dare to hold out any hope based on so unsubstantial a theory. But the interview had this effect upon me. If the possibility remains of fixing guilt elsewhere than on Miss Challoner's inconsiderate impulse, I am ready to devote any amount of time and strength to the work. To see this grieving father relieved from the worst part of his burden is worth some effort, and now you know why I have listened so eagerly to you. Sweetwater, I will go with you to the superintendent. We may not gain his attention, and again we may. If we don't But we won't cross that bridge prematurely. When will you be ready for this business?" "I must be at headquarters tomorrow." "Good. Then let it be tomorrow. A taxicab, Sweetwater. The subway is for the young. I can no longer manage the stairs." End of chapter 13. Of initials only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2. As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 14. A Concession. "It is true. There seems to be something extraordinary in the coincidence." Thus Mr. Brotherson in the presence of the inspector. "But that is all there is to it," he easily proceeded. "I knew Miss Challoner, and I have already said how much and how little I had to do with her death. The other woman I did not know at all. I did not even know her name. A prosecution based on grounds so flimsy as those you advance would savor of persecution, would it not?" The inspector, surprised by this unexpected attack, regarded the speaker with an interest rather augmented than diminished by his boldness. The smile with which he had uttered these concluding words yet lingered on his lips, lighting up features of a mold too suggestive of command to be associated readily with guilt. That the impression thus produced was favorable was evident from the tone of the inspector's reply. "We have said nothing about prosecution, Mr. Brotherson. We hope to avoid any such extreme measures, and that we may the more readily do so, we have given you this opportunity to make such explanations as the situation, which you yourself has characterized as remarkable, seems to call for." "I am ready. But what am I called upon to explain? I really cannot see, sir. Knowing nothing more about either case than you do, I fear that I shall not add much to your enlightenment." "You can tell us why, with your seeming culture and obvious means, you choose to spend so much time in a second-rate tenement like the one in Hicks Street." Again that chill smile preceding the quiet answer. "Have you seen my room there? It is piled to the ceiling with books. When I was a poor man, I chose the abode suited to my purse and my passion for first-rate reading. As I grew better off, my time became daily more valuable. I have never seen the hour when I felt like moving that precious collection. Besides, I am a man of the people. I like the working class, and am willing to be thought one of them. I can find a time to talk to a hard-pushed mechanic as easily as to such members of the moneyed class as I encounter on stray evenings at the Hotel Claremont. I have led, I may say that I am leading, a double life, but of neither am I ashamed, nor have I cause to be. Love drove me to ape the gentleman in the halls of the Claremont, a broad human interest in the work of the world, to live as a fellow among the mechanics of Hicks Street." "But why make use of one name as a gentleman of leisure and quite a different one as the honest workman?" "Ah, there you touch upon my real secret. I have a reason for keeping my identity quiet till my invention is completed." "A reason connected with your anarchistic tendencies?" "Possibly." But the word was uttered in a way to carry little conviction. "I am not much of an anarchist," he now took the trouble to declare, with a careless lift of his shoulders. "I like fair play, but I shall never give you much trouble by my manner of ensuring it. I have too much at stake. My invention is dearer to me than the overthrow of present institutions. Nothing must stand in the way of its success, not even the satisfaction of inspiring terror in minds shut to every other species of argument. I have uttered my last speech. You can rely on me for that." "We are glad to hear it, Mr. Dunn. Physical overthrow carries more than the immediate sufferer with it." If this were meant as an irritant, it did not act successfully. The social agitator, the political demagogue, the orator whose honeyed tones had rung with biting invective in the ears of the united brotherhood of the awl, the plane, and the trowel, simply bowed and calmly waited for the next attack. Perhaps it was of a nature to surprise even him. "We have no wish," continued the inspector, "to probe too closely into concerns seemingly quite removed from the main issue. You say that you are ready, nay more, are even eager, to answer all questions. You will probably be anxious then to explain away a discrepancy between your word and your conduct, which has come to our attention. You were known to have expressed the intention of spending the afternoon of Mrs. Spot's death in New York, and were supposed to have done so, yet you were certainly seen in the crowd which invaded that rear building at the first alarm. Are you conscious of possessing a double, or did you fail to cross the river as you expected to?" "I am glad this has come up." The tone was one of self-congratulation which would have shaken Sweetwater sorely had he been admitted to this unofficial examination. "I have never confided to anyone the story of my doings on that unhappy afternoon, because I knew of no one who would take any interest in them. But this is what occurred. I did mean to go to New York, and I even started on my walk to the bridge at the hour mentioned. But I got into a small crowd on the corner of Fulton Street, in which a poor devil who had robbed a vendor's cart of a few oranges was being hustled about. There was no policeman within sight, and so I busied myself there for a minute, paying for the oranges and dragging the poor wretch away into an alley where I could have the pleasure of seeing him eat them. When I came out of the alley the small crowd had vanished, but a big one was collecting up the street very near my home. I always think of my books when I see anything suggesting fire, and naturally I returned, and equally naturally, when I heard what had happened, followed the crowd into the court, and so up into the poor woman's doorway. But my curiosity satisfied, I returned at once to the street and went to New York as I had planned." "Do you mind telling us where you went in New York?" "Not at all. I went shopping. I wanted a certain very fine wire, for an experiment I had on hand, and I found it in a little shop in Fourth Avenue. If I remember rightly, the name over the door was Grippus. Its oddity struck me." There was nothing left to the inspector but to dismiss him. He had answered all questions willingly, and with a countenance inexpressive of guile. He even indulged in a parting shot on his own account, as full of frank acceptance of the situation as it was fearless in its attack. As he halted in the doorway, before turning his back upon the room, he smiled for the third time as he quietly said, "I have ceased visiting my friend's apartment in Upper New York. If you ever want me again, you will find me amongst my books. If my invention halts and other interests stale, you have furnished me this day with a problem which cannot fail to give continual occupation to my energies. If I succeed in solving it first, I shall be happy to share my knowledge with you. Till then, trust the laws of nature. No man, when once on the outside of a door, can button it on the inside, nor could anyone without the gift of complete invisibility make a leap over 15 feet from the sill of a fourth-story window onto an adjacent fire-escape without attracting the attention of some of the many children playing down below." He was halfway out the door, but his name quickly spoken by the inspector drew him back. "Anything more?" he asked. The inspector smiled. "You are a man of considerable analytic power, as I take it, Mr. Brotherson. You must have decided long ago how this woman died." "Is that a question, Inspector?" "You may take it as such." "Then I will allow myself to say that there is but one common-sense view to take of the matter. Miss Challoner's death was due to suicide. So was that of the washerwoman. But there I stop. As for the means, the motive, such mysteries may be within your province, but they are totally outside mine. God help us all. The world is full of misery. Again I wish you good day." The air seemed to have lost its vitality and the sun its sparkle when he was gone. "Now what do you think, Gryce?" The old man rose and came out of his corner. "This. I am up against the hardest proposition of my lifetime. Nothing in the man's appearance or manner evinces guilt, yet I believe him guilty. I must. Not to is to strain probability to the point of breakage. But how to reach him is a problem, and one of no ordinary nature. Years ago, when I was but little older than Sweetwater, I had just such a conviction concerning a certain man against whom I had even less to work on than we have here. A murder had been committed by an envenomed spring contained in a toy puzzle. I worked upon the conscience of the suspect in that case by bringing constantly before his eyes a facsimile of that spring. It met him in the folded napkin which he opened at his restaurant dinner. He stumbled upon it in the street, and found it lying amongst his papers at home. I gave him no relief, and finally he succumbed. He had been almost driven mad by remorse. But this man has no conscience. If he's not innocent as the day, he's as hard as unquarried marble. He might be confronted by reminders of his crime at every turn, without weakening or showing by loss of appetite or interrupted sleep any effect upon his nerves. That's my opinion of the gentleman. He is either that or a man of uncommon force and self-restraint. I'm inclined to believe him the latter, and so give the whole matter the go-by? Possibly. It will be a terrible disappointment to Sweetwater. That's nothing. And to me. That's different. I'm disposed to consider you, Gryce, after all these years. Thank you. I have done the state some service. What do you want? You say the mine is unworkable. Yes, in a day, or in a week, possibly in a month. But persistence and a protean adaptability to meet his moods might accomplish something. I don't say will, I only say might. If Sweetwater had the job, with unlimited time in which to carry out any plan he may have, or even for a change of plans to suit a changed idea, success might be his, and both time, effort, and outlay justified. The outlay? I am thinking of the outlay. Mr. Challoner will see to that. I have his word that no reasonable amount will daunt him. But this Brotherson is suspicious. He has an inventor's secret to hide, if none other. We can't saddle him with a guy of Sweetwater's appearance and abnormal loquaciousness. Not readily, I own, but time will bring counsel. Are you willing to help the boy, to help me, and possibly yourself by this venture in the dark? The department shan't lose money by it. That's all I can promise. But it's a big one. Gryce, you shall have your way. You'll be the only loser if you fail, and you will fail, take my word for it. I wish I could speak as confidently to the contrary, but I can't. I can give you my hand, though, Inspector, and Sweetwater's thanks. I can meet the boy now. An hour ago I didn't know how I was to do it. End of chapter 14.